And I remember working, side by side with really one engineer and a graduate student, cobbling together prototypes in a rented lab space. It was incredibly scrappy, but it did lay the foundation for everything that we built since. We got through those, kind of terrifying early days by really just trying to stay laser focused on one milestone at a time. Can we prove feasibility? Can we get physician feedback? Can we secure that first investor check?
I'm Felicia Shakiba, and this is CPO Playbook, where we solve a business challenge in every episode. Great ideas don't automatically become great companies, especially in healthcare where FDA-approved reimbursement and investor buy-in can make or break innovation. Sasha Schrode knows this firsthand. After more than 20 years in medtech and a deeply personal journey shaped by her own cancer diagnosis, she went from licensing IP out of the University of Pennsylvania to raising venture capital, bringing multiple products through the FDA, and selling her first company. Today, she leads FEMSelect as CEO, continuing to turn early-stage ideas into commercial reality. In this episode, we break down the playbook, how to take an innovation from lab to market without losing your shirt, your sanity, or your shot at impact. Sasha, it's so wonderful to see you today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. I'm especially excited for this conversation because I think it's, an excellent time in medtech overall. And I think we're at an exciting inflection point.
Yeah, and you've said your personal story with cancer shaped your career. So how did that experience influence your decision to move into healthcare entrepreneurship?
Yes, it did. I think when you face a serious health challenge, for me, it was a cancer diagnosis in my 30s. It really changes how you see time and purpose. And I think thankfully my cancer was diagnosed in the early stages when the cancer is more amenable to curative treatment. But it gave me the opportunity to really think about my legacy and legacy I want to leave behind. And maybe more importantly, the impact that I want to make in the world while I'm healthy. And I think for me as a mom, it also helped me think about, the type of example I want to set for my kids and show them that, despite a setback like cancer, anything is possible. And I had spent, years in healthcare at that point, about 10 years, and my diagnosis made me have a greater appreciation for my own health and healthcare innovation. I also realized how critical it is to bring, science out of a lab and into the hands of physicians. And that's what pulled me into entrepreneurship because, as a founder, you can shorten that gap between innovation and impact. As I shared, I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of complexity in translating, research into a commercial product that will actually, touch the hands of a patient or a physician and really make a positive impact one day. The statistics are alarming, I would say. I think less than 1% of, the research today actually makes it to widespread patient use. There's
Wow.
so many different hurdles along the way. And I think shortening that gap is critical.
I do relate to what you had said earlier about, what is the legacy you want to leave for your children. I've had those moments in my life as well. I have two little kids, and I think when you become a mom, at least for me, or a dad or a parent, I think that you think a lot about what kind of role model you want to be for them and what they want to like grow up and look up to. And I can see how strongly that tie is between like you and your work and your personal life. So thank you for sharing
Yes,
that.
absolutely. Thank you.
And before founding your first company, what what were the roles in your career that really gave you the confidence and the toolkit to take this incredible leap?
So before founding my first company, which was Serpex Medical, I was fortunate to gain experience across many aspects of medtech business. But I actually started my career in finance at Merrill Lynch. And then I transitioned to big pharma and then eventually into medtech. And I had roles in sales, marketing, management. All of those kind of gave me the opportunity to work with our regulatory teams and manufacturing. And eventually I started investing with an angel group called Robinhood Ventures, which I'm still a partner in today. I think that really allowed me the opportunity to see things from an investor's perspective, maybe maybe a more critical perspective, actually. I think each of these roles gave me skills and confidence that became invaluable as a founder. And that said, I think it's really important to remember that I could not have ever been so successful with that first company without the support of my incredible team, my R&D team and my investors. My chairman of the first company, Serpex Medical, was the CEO of a venture capital firm called Ajax Health. And he was a great mentor to me. And his team really taught me a lot. They were patient with me as a first time founder. And I think when I was learning, they gave me the confidence to push me forward. And when I felt strongly about a decision, they also respected, my opinion. So I think together we worked really hard to make the company a success. And I really believe in the end, the key to the success isn't just, my experience. It's really the strength of the team that you're surrounding yourself with.
I love that you have, I think the team is so important, but I'm really interested in how you got started. Can you walk us
Yeah.
through the moment that you first licensed IP from Penn? Like what did those
Yes.
early days look like with just I think one engineer and a grant funding?
Yes.
Oh my
Yes. Yes. It was exciting. I think maybe equally exhilarating and terrifying at the same time.
as it should be. As it should
Yes.
be.
Yes. So when I came to meet the co-founder of the company was a robotics professor at the University of Penn, Mark Yim, brilliant. And he had a student that was working in his lab who stayed on the project. So they essentially had an idea, a provisional patent, and a small grant from the National Science Foundation. And I remember working, side by side with really one engineer and a graduate student cobbling together prototypes in a rented lab space. It was incredibly scrappy, but it did lay the foundation for, everything that we built since. We got through those, kind of terrifying early days by really just trying to stay laser focused on one milestone at a time. Can we prove feasibility? Can we get, physician feedback? Can we secure that first investor check? But I would say, a pivotal part of that journey really was when we received our grant from the National Science Foundation. Part of that, and in fact, most grants are this way, even NIH grants, which are common non dilutive funding sources for early stage medtech, they required us to do voice of customer research. And that process is really transformative. We interviewed physicians directly, asking them about the challenges that they faced and then aligning, those insights with the business case. And it was a critical step. And ultimately, that step led us to our first major pivot. Originally, when I licensed the Pen IP, the idea was to leverage a steerable needle technology to reach difficult to access regions of the liver, particularly the hepatic dome, through solid tissue. So it was a mechanically novel, elegant way to navigate tortuous anatomy without relying on expensive robotics, which meant the potential for a more cost effective solution. And physicians that we spoke with were really excited about the prospect of being able to biopsy and or maybe deliver ablative therapy to these lesions in the liver. But as we dug deeper, the reality set in, and we learned that the tools physicians were using to biopsy the liver were surprisingly inexpensive. And the critical question became, how much more would a hospital be willing to pay for our device? And that answer was sobering. It was not much. So at best, they might reserve the most challenging cases for this type of technology. And so that's really common. So, I think for us, that meant our addressable market would be far smaller than we initially hoped. On top of that, we realized that the device would require a high degree of technical skill to operate. So limiting its use to probably a small subset of high volume physicians. So although there was an unmet need, the challenge was really that the market wouldn't likely be willing to pay for the innovation in order to use it on every case. And they'd only be willing to pay for it sometimes. I mean, unfortunately, that's not really a sustainable business model. It's more of a niche application and probably not something that investors would get behind, possibly as part of a bigger platform, which is eventually how we segmented the market. So we thought about the intellectual property and figured, well, the solid tissue application and for percutaneous applications, maybe we want to keep that intellectual property, but let's think about it a little differently. And so that's how we really rethink the opportunity. The steerable capability itself was unique, but maybe the liver wasn't where it would make the biggest impact. So through that discovery process, we really identified the lung as a far more compelling application. And that anatomy was equally complex. The unmet need was even greater, and the potential adoption curve would be much stronger. So that pivot became a defining moment for us as a company. One of those early lessons that really stayed with me ever since. So I think when you think about technology, I think the technology matters and it's important, but understanding the customer and the business case is absolutely critical.
We'll be right back. Back to the show. And that's really important. Like all that you said was really around like these are the pieces of the puzzle of how you decide if an idea is worth building a company around, right? Like
Right.
that criteria of, what are they paying for? Would they be using it all the time? Would a hospital be willing to pay for it? Is it innovative enough? Adoption curve, like these are all the pieces that you have to decide on in order to build the company.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, it's complicated. It really is, and I think, when I think about whether an idea is worth building a company around, and I always come back to a key filter, there's I should say, several key filters, clinical need, market viability, regulatory reimbursement pathway. Even if one of those is missing, the company will stall, no matter how exciting the science is. And
Hmm.
I've passed, from an investor perspective, I've passed on ideas that were, technically brilliant, but they didn't have a reimbursement pathway. And that can be a challenge. Not to say it's not possible, but it can be a challenge. Or if a payer isn't, willing to pay for it, that may limit adoption. And I think on the flip side, if you have a clear unmet clinical need and a strong case for economic value, you can really rally investors and clinicians behind it. So I think you have to really be thoughtful. um, I think I went, early on, I said we're really in an era of cost containment. So hospitals are price sensitive. And I think if we think about the bigger picture in the United States, we spend a lot of money on healthcare. And at the end of the day, what really matters is clinical outcomes. And, the costs are still growing faster than, the economy. So,
Well,
the context I think underscores why our solutions have to work clinically, and they also have to demonstrate measurable value. And, hospitals, physicians, they're asked about the price. They want to know how your technology is priced relative to the competition. They want to know, what is reimbursement for it. Sometimes physicians may not know that, but before they can bring it into a healthcare, to their hospital or their ASC, they have to go through a value analysis committee. And so that's the kind of group of clinicians that are looking at the business case for your solution.
and in order to get all of this information and these insights, you have to kind of go to the voice of the customer and understand what that looks like.
Yes.
How do you get in healthcare, your customer, the physician. So, how do you actually get very busy physicians who are paid for their time to share their insights about, a product that may or may not work?
Great question. So, getting busy physicians to open up and share meaningful insights is especially challenging. But I think one of the kind of frameworks that I think about, when I think of and look at medtech solutions, is that a lot of times there is a physician behind the innovation. So maybe it was a physician or a patient that actually had the idea, and they're still very involved in the company. So maybe as a first step, I always would recommend, and that's certainly what we did, is to start with that physician and then try to expand on their network. So if they have partners that they could introduce you to, that's a great place to start. Who did they go to medical school with? Who did they do their fellowship with? A lot of times those physicians are willing to have a conversation with you. I also think if if you're open to, kind of being a good listener and being a learner, I think interviewing everyone and asking them for introductions is kind of a great place to start to kind of grow your network, especially in academic medical centers. They're really used to it, but you also want to make sure you're getting a diverse set of opinions. So try to spread your interview process across academic medical centers, community medical centers, private practice physicians. So they all bring a unique perspective that you will want to understand. Lots to understand, lots to take in. I think that process is also complex. Let's say maybe a physician isn't associated with it. Another option is there are some consulting groups that would help you through that process. So that's a backup, but it does cost money. I believe that the best way to really learn is really trying to kind of immerse yourself in a case or, the kind of clinical environment that you're trying to work in. So I think the most authentic experience you're going to get is coming from shadowing physicians, nurses. I would say for me, when I started out in med tech, I was in sales. So that gave me the opportunity to work alongside physicians and see the challenges that, I was observing them silently and kind of taking notes, looking for inefficiencies, pain points, workarounds. So I think framing yourself as a learner is really important. And that'll go a long way. I think clinicians generally want to see innovation, and they're usually really excited to kind of help and support entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think, and even today, I'm always learning from, especially from
Yeah.
people like yourself. I definitely consult in the world of biotech or med tech, but by no means am I a professional in this industry. I mean, you clearly have just, like you said, immersed yourself in understanding and learning and framing yourself as a learner. I think that is actually so sometimes even more valuable than the time that you're actually paid for because you learn so much, you gather so much data, and you're able to not just know what people are saying or hear what people are saying, but observational data is just as important, right? And it does sound too like what you said that the economics matter just as much as the science. So, in your
Yeah.
world, like how do you weigh reimbursement, costs, and competition when you're deciding if a product can actually survive?
Yeah. In medtech, economics matters just as much as the science. You're absolutely right. You really, I don't think you ask, can we build it? You probably want to be thinking, will the system pay for it? And will a physician adopt it? Reimbursement, cost, competition, they have to be part of the conversation from day one because you really can't retrofit reimbursement later. And with my company now, FEMSelect, our end place system, we had to prove more than just safety, but we had to prove safety and efficacy. There was some existing codes, but we did get our own unique code for our technology as well. And we really had to show that hospitals could bill for the procedure and that insurance would cover it for investors to be interested in backing the company. So I think the financial story was just as important as the clinical one. And, that's especially true for, minimally invasive procedures in the United States. We're really shifting from open kind of invasive procedures to minimally invasive procedures. And that's, that can really reduce hospital stays by a couple days and it saves a lot of money. And certainly it's better for the patient. So, I think a lot of research is really demonstrating that laparoscopic, minimally invasive procedures can really lower overall healthcare costs. So the episode of care cost by anywhere from 10 to 30%, like depending on the procedure. So that's the type of critical savings that can create a payer story and accelerate adoption. And of course, as I shared, more importantly is really the patient will benefit as well. So I think kind of lesson is probably clear. I think if the economics don't align between the pricing, the margins on your solution, the reimbursement pathways, even really the best clinical data won't carry a product to success. So you really have to show measurable value to patients and to the system.
Prototyping, cadavers, animal
Mhm.
models. What did that iteration process look like? And what's the biggest
Mhm.
lesson from building in healthcare?
So iteration in medtech is humbling to say the least. You can spend months perfecting what feels like a beautiful prototype. And then the first time a surgeon touches it, they'll immediately point out three things you missed. So the biggest lesson is fall in love with the problem and not your solution.
Yeah.
I think every failed innovation or iteration is really just data that gets you closer to something that's going to work, right? And, in the early stages, prototyping is really about proof of concept. So answering the question, can this even work? So once you have a prototype that feels promising, you kind of escalate the testing environment to make it more relevant. So that can usually start in a preclinical model or maybe a cadaver lab. And then, if that device, you kind of want to see how that device interacts with real anatomy in the hands of a physician. So from there, as I share, I call it like escalating that testing environment. So you kind of want to move from that preclinical model to, let's say, a large animal or small animal, depending on the device. And this really isn't optional, and there's not a lot of choice in it. It really, FDA requires specific preclinical or animal studies as part of the regulatory approval process. And that's really part of demonstrating both feasibility and safety before you can go into a human trial. So those early cadaver and animal studies they're messy, but it's also where some of the biggest breakthroughs happen. So I think they really expose the flaws that maybe you don't see on the bench, which is really, in your lab. And they force you to adapt quickly. So for us, those iterations shaped our final device more than, a computer model ever could.
As an entrepreneur, you raised venture capital and then eventually sold your first company. What do you wish more founders knew about investors and strategics in healthcare?
So raising venture capital and or early stage capital from, let's say, angel investors and ultimately exiting a company taught me a lot about what investors are really looking for in healthcare. And I think even being an angel investor kind of helped me think about things a little differently. And I think first, investors want to believe in the team as often more than the technology. And I think the science can evolve, features change, as we just talked about, iterations on your technology early on when you're initially pitching may change very significantly over time. But the grit, the judgment, adaptability of the team and the team's willingness to pivot is harder to teach. And even private equity analysts will consistently share that leadership is really the critical differentiator. Companies with strong founder-led teams get more favorable multiples and better exit prospects. So I think that's critical. Second, strategy, timing. I think when dealing with strategic acquirers, these things really matter. Strategics aren't buying when you're ready. They're buying when the product fits their pipeline or complements their existing portfolio or is filling a gap. So I think the fit has to be compelling, not just a good device. But I think that this is something that they're committed to looking for new solutions, and you have to make sure that you're showing them that your solution might solve a critical gap in their portfolio.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's so interesting that you went from entrepreneur to an entrepreneur who's exited, now CEO, and also investor. So you've
Yes.
been through every single role, and it's such a natural progression too. I mean,
Yeah.
you're extremely accomplished, and it really says a lot about you as someone who actually understands the different perspectives and has a lot of empathy. For entrepreneurs, you would be a wonderful investor, or at least I would think for someone
Thanks.
that would invest in me as someone who's been through it, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. Well, I mean, what's the most common mistake that you see first time healthcare innovators make when trying to commercialize their idea? And now we had a guest on the show who was just going through this. She had a wonderful technology, and it was about like early breast cancer detection. And she was just going through commercialization. So, what are the common mistakes that you see um, when trying to do this?
Another great question. The number one mistake is probably underestimating the time and capital it takes. So when in the eyes of commercialization, there's various different ways. At least in the United States, a lot of med tech companies kind of either bring on their own direct sales force and or may partner with a distributor. So that's kind of the first
Mm.
step in the process is kind of deciding maybe what is the best pathway for your technology. But then I think many first time founders imagine it's a 2-year, $2 million journey. And in reality, it's often closer to a decade and tens of millions of dollars
Wow.
before you will see broad adoption. So, again, I think thinking about it more realistically is critical because it impacts how much money you're raising, the kind of team you can build. And at the end of the day, what you really want to do is prove to the market that your solution is going to have positive clinical outcomes and be safe. And maybe you only need a few sales reps to do that, but I think you have to be thoughtful about your approach. And if, let's say, you're a company that has a pipeline, so you want to slowly build out your sales team, that's a totally different strategy on its own. So thinking about that again, just being more realistic with the time and capital that it would take. So I think that comes with probably some experience. So making sure you have a strong commercial leader on your team that knows the customer, understands the type of sales rep that you want to attract for your solution. Again, going back to my company, FEMSelect, our technology is one that's unique in that we are kind of changing the way physicians treat prolapse, pelvic organ prolapse for women. And our sales reps all have almost 20 years of medical device experience working side by side with physicians, showing them how to do these types of procedures. And that gives a physician confidence in the operating room that they will trust that sales rep. And if something, is going wrong, they know that the sales rep knows what they're doing and can kind of talk them through that process. We also have a lot of, training that's involved with that beforehand. But in any event, I think there's a lot of decisions to make when you're thinking about commercializing a solution. So you want to be really thoughtful about the technical feasibility of a distribution field team versus which we would call like a 1099 sales team versus a direct W-2 sales force.
We'll be right back. Back to the show. Where do you find these? Where do you grow a sales team? I mean, you say 1099 and, do you start with a consultant? Do you, bring someone on full time? I'm just curious how that gets
Yeah.
started.
So I would say the first step is like, I always want to bring in a commercial leader that knows the space and knows physicians and also has relationships and has kind of a network. So I think that's a great place to start is bringing in a strong commercial leader. I mean, oftentimes early stage companies may just have that one commercial leader leading sales. And then they will leverage their network and bring in appropriate sales team to support them in that process. We use a combination of like our own existing network, and then we often have relationships with recruiters. And we're also engaging with physicians and asking them, who do they know? Who do they like? Who do they trust? That's also a great place to start when you're looking for sales people to say, who do you know that you like? And maybe they'd be open to a new opportunity. And we can kind of start with the physician.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, obviously, if you have the funding to bring someone on like that, then I think that makes sense because you're technically acquiring, a potential network of clients or customers, right? With
Yes.
that one hire. Yeah.
Yes. And
If
sometimes
some
it's the CEO.
Yeah,
The CEO can be the first sales rep, and that's okay too.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think you should, I think it's very commendable to start that way, right? You're on your own and
Yeah.
you're the CEO, and to be able to start that way, I think you should. But technically, what you said, I mean, you know the space way better than I do. And I think that makes a lot of sense. If someone's listening that has innovation today and wants to take it to market, like an idea, what are the first 3 steps that you would tell them to take tomorrow?
So I would say first validate the need. And that kind of goes back to that voice of customer. Don't fall in love with your solution, fall in love with the problem. And I think taking the time to really conduct thorough interviews. One of the tips that I always have is, kind of build a survey and use that same survey across all of your voice of customer so that you're capturing the same information across a broad subset of physicians or clinicians that you're looking to interview. Don't you have to really do your real due diligence to ensure you really understand the need. And then if it's viable, you really want to map that pathway. So before you spend money on engineering, understand the regulatory and reimbursement routes. Understand what clinicians or health system is willing to pay for the technology. Is there a clear, FDA pathway? Is there a payer code or a credible way to get one? And companies without a reimbursement strategy rarely scale. So no matter how exciting the technology, that can prove to be a really big challenge. Finding the right allies. So what I mean by that is really the right team. And that can be your technical team, it's your advisors, and it's also your investors and your partners. It's not a solo journey. So whether you're a co-founder or an early, clinical advisor or you're an investor, I think you want to surround yourself with people who've walked this road before. And I think their judgment and support will help you and probably take years of wasted effort away. So I think, these aren't going to necessarily guarantee success, but it's the first step in that process to, thinking about building a successful company.
Yeah. Sasha, your journey is so incredible. And what you've accomplished and what you stand for is extremely admirable. And it's a true honor to have you on our show and share that story. And I hope that those who are listening will one day create an innovation to save millions of lives. And I think that there's a real possibility that after listening to you, they will. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Visit us at cpoplaybook.com. Your support as a subscriber means the world to us. So thank you for tuning in. I'm Felicia Shakiba. Let's connect on LinkedIn.